I guess we should start, right?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So, few announcements. Uh, we are recording this session, so yeah, everyone should keep that in mind. And second is like Jitsi is more democratic in some ways than Zoom, I guess. So no one person can control another person's activities. So everyone else who isn't speaking should keep their mics closed or muted when not needed, so it doesn't create noises. So yeah, let's start. I'll be the facilitator today, and my name is Sarthak. I'm from Bhopal. I'm a law student here and an organizer with Muktiwadi Ekta Morcha (MEM), which is a syndicalist union here, and this is this third red and black sessions. The first, these are organized by loosely connected anarchists within the mainland India, and the first session was on basics of organizing. The second was on basics of anarchism. Today's session is on anarchism in India, which is particularly focusing on this unfortunately, little known figure, MPT Acharya, and delivering the talk and then here for question and answer is Ole Birk Laursen. He he, as most of you might know, edited the writings of Acharya um, in the volume called "We Are Anarchists," and is a research fellow in Asian studies in at various like in currently at International Institute in of Asian Studies in Leiden, I guess,
Yes.
and and is also, as he right now mentioned, is also working on a full length book on Acharya, and yeah, so all here you go.
Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction, Tatak, and thanks for inviting me to speak to you guys here today. As you said, I'm currently writing a longer biography of the Indian anarchist M.P.T Acharya. It really started out as a quite small project because I didn't know how much material there was going to be, and then I found enough for this editor collection of some of Acharya's essays. When I first proposed that to AK Press, um, I had collected 30 essays, and I proposed to write a 3,000 word introduction. That was it. That was all I expected I could do. As I got into it, that expanded to 50 essays in that collection and an 11,000 word introduction, biographical introduction. And that seemed a lot at the time. Since then, I've kept working on Acharya, keep finding material, and maybe some of you heard just now, I have over 200 essays by Acharya. Some of them and published in various languages. I'd say half of them are in English. There's quite a lot in German and in French, and some in Spanish and Italian and Dutch, various European languages. And some of them were reprinted in various other journals at the same time. That was quite normal. So you would publish, say, in the American journal Road to Freedom, and that would then be reprinted in an anarchist journal in Germany and then in France and whatnot. So they would circulate. Um, and the same goes for Acharya's essays. And a lot of, as I said, I have around 200 or more than 200 now of his essays, and most of them deal with anarchism in some form, but a lot of them also on more general topics. As I mentioned, he was a correspondent for the Bombay Chronicle in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and there's even an article on wrestling. There's a couple of film reviews he did as well. He was trying to scrape by as a journalist and would have to take on in any writing that he could. But I've kept working on him for a couple of years now. I keep finding material, particularly here in I'm in the Netherlands now. I'm close to Amsterdam, where there's an archive called the International Institute for Social History, which has a huge collection of particularly anarchist material, and there's quite a lot on Acharya, more than is actually catalogued, and it's become, it's quite difficult to look for him, because often you would have to look in between what other people are saying about him. But I'll start by giving so I'll talk about Acharya today and some of the anarchists that he knew, and I'll try and focus mostly on the interwar period from about the time when he sort of turned to anarchism in late 1922 until the mid 1930s, when he fled Nazi Germany and went back to India, because it's quite an interesting period in general. So, and I've sent around a PowerPoint presentation. You can follow what I'm saying in that. So I'll just dive into it now. So in his memoirs, Revolution and Regression from 1952, the German anarchist Rudolf Rocker wrote about Berlin in the post-Russian Revolution years that Berlin was at that time a center for political refugees, as in other epochs. It was Paris, Geneva, Zurich, or London. In those years, there was also a large number of Indians. They had their own circle in the eastern part, which served mainly as a point of reference and mostly had the task of financially helping its most destitute members. Most of the members of the club were Indian students who had been sent to Germany during and after the war and continued their studies at the University of Berlin. Almost all were declared nationalists, but among them were also some who expressed a keen interest in libertarian ideas, like our young comrade Acharya, well known in our environment. Acharya lived for a few years in Berlin and then returned to India, where he continued to participate very actively in the libertarian movement. And Rocker continues, the soul of the circle was the well-known Indian nationalist Chattopadhyaya, or Chatto, as it was customary to call him. He lived in Berlin then with the American writer Agnes Smedley, who later became famous as a journalist and author of some books on China. I met them through Emma Goldman, who was seeing them in Moscow, and Millie and I often met with them in Berlin. So, as Rocker notes here, there was a group of Indians in Berlin in the 1920s who took an interest in anarchist and libertarian ideas, namely M.P.T. Acharya and Virendranath Chattopadhyaya, or Chatto, as he was known, two Indian revolutionaries who'd known each other since they met in London in late 1908. And they even lived together at various times in Paris, in Berlin during the First World War, and then in Stockholm in the latter years of the First World War. I should also briefly mention that the Rudolf Rocker's memoirs that I talked about here, that covers the period from 1918 to 1951, was published by his friend Diego Abad de Santillan, a Spanish anarchist, and has, to the best of my knowledge, not been translated into English yet. So I think there's an English translated reprint long overdue. And de Santillane was also a friend of Acharya in Berlin. They knew each other around then. So I think Rocker's inclusion of this section on the Indians in Berlin may have been prompted by a letter he received from his friend, the German anarchist Augustin Souchy, in July 1946, at a time when the international anarchist movement tried to reconvene after the Second World War. Souchy wrote to Rocker, and I quote here, "I've received a letter from Acharya from Bombay. I'm sure you remember him. He translated the press service of the IWMA force in Berlin. He used to be with Chattopadhyaya, but split with him when Chattopadhyaya joined the communists. I believe he's the only comrade we have in India." End quote. So indeed, by the mid-1940s, Acharya was, if not the only, then certainly the most prominent anarchist in India. But as Rock also notes, Chatto too traveled in the anarchist circles in Berlin in the 1920s. And in my talk today, I'll try and explore these connections a bit further and the development of an Indian anarchist group in Berlin at the time, and to think about anti-colonialism and anti-militarism as well through organizations such as the anarcho-syndicalist International Working Men's Association, and also the pacifist, sort of anarcho-pacifist organization called the International Anti-Militarist Bureau. And I'm drawing on various archives from across India, Britain, and Germany and France and whatnot. To as I said, I'm trying to write a biography of Acharya. I'm not trying to uncover sort of a major overlooked chapter of global anarchism in the interwar years, as I think we have to acknowledge that the contribution of Acharya and Chatto was relatively minor in some ways. But I am trying to bring sort of Indian anti-colonialism into much closer conversation with anarchism than often assumed, and conversely to think about how anarchists at that time approached the question of anti-colonialism in the interwar period. So with that in mind, I'll start with a brief overview of what we might call the Indian Revolution movement in exile, from the time when Acharya went into exile, leading up to the Russian Revolution, and then the subsequent turn to anarchism for Chatto. So, as I mentioned, Acharya and Chatto had known each other since late 1908, when Acharya fled India to avoid a potential imprisonment for his involvement in publishing seditious literature. He was editor of a paper called India in Madras, in Chennai, that subsequently moved to Pondicherry to avoid sort of the scrutiny of the British intelligence service. But they wanted him, and he fled India in late 1908 to avoid a potential imprisonment. Arriving in London in late 1908, he soon became active in the so-called India House group, a very militant nationalist group in London, which also counted Chatto among its members at the time. And over the next 10 years, the two of them actually worked together in various capacities across Europe, North America, and the Middle East, before they set up the Indian National Committee in Stockholm in May 1917. So in May 1917, and followed in the wake of particularly harsh winter during the First World War, and the February Revolution in Russia, in the wake of all of that, socialists, particularly social democrats from within the divided Second International, gathered in Stockholm in the spring of 1917 to prepare for a socialist peace conference. At the same time, anti-colonial nationalists from across India and Egypt and Persia and Morocco and Ireland, among other nations, also arrived in Stockholm, to bring the question of independence and self-determination into these peace talks. Now, by and large, the demands sort of set up to aid Indian students in Germany, but also had a slightly subversive or revolutionary character to it. And M.N. Roy actually also made his way to Berlin, and in many ways was really at the center of the British surveillance efforts. Recording. Sorry, so I said M.N. Roy also made his way to Berlin and was really at the center of British surveillance efforts in Berlin at the time, much more so than Chatto and Acharya, because of his ties with the Communist International in Moscow. So shortly after Acharya's arrival in early December 1922, a group of anarchists met in Berlin over the New Year's period to reform the International Working Men's Association, the IWMA, as sort of an anarcho-syndicalist rival to the Communist International, as well as the International Federation of Trade Unions, the so-called Amsterdam International, which is more of a, I suppose, a social democratic organization. And the IWMA had Rudolf Rocker, Christine Suchi, and Alexander Shapiro as secretaries, so quite well-known names in the international anarchist movement at the time. So what we know is that a group of Indians, including Acharya and most likely Chatto, also attended that founding meeting, but I don't know who the others were, or indeed if there were other Indians who attended that. We just know that there was a group of Indians. As a report from the IWMA stated, and I quote here, "In agreement with the Indian comrades in Berlin, an Indian Committee for Propaganda of Revolutionary Syndicalism has been formed." So clearly there was a group of Indians who were responsible for revolutionary propaganda at the time. The committee was not officially attached to the IWMA, but worked with the support of the organization. And already in February 1923, Acharya started writing about the work of the IWMA and anarchism more generally for Indian left-wing papers, such as Forward and the Socialist and various other Indian papers at the time, which led to, already a month later, in March 1923, the government of India banned the import of anarchist IWMA literature into India. In response to that, the IWMA actually sarcastically noted, and I quote here, "The first success we have had in India is the fact that the government of India has banned the import of IWMA literature." That said, so the government of India didn't really know much about Acharya and the IWMA, and in the reports where they banned IWMA literature, they confused it with M.N. Roy's communist activities, which probably suggests that they were actually more concerned with the threat of communism than anarchism at the time. Nevertheless, so by the early to mid-1920s, Acharya and Chatto soon associated more with the anarchists in Berlin than with the communists there. At the center of the Indian community in Berlin, Chatto became friendly with several notable anarchists, and even, according to the biography of Chatto, and I quote here, regularly attended study group meetings with Goldman, Bergman, and some of the leading anarchist thinkers in Europe, including the German Rudolf Rocker and the Italian Armando Borghi. According to his partner, Agnes Smedley, Chatto also translated for the anarcho-syndicalist, the Free Workers' Union of Germany's paper called Der Syndikalist, the Syndicalist. And Chatto's brother-in-law, A.C. and Nambiar, who stayed with Chatto and Smedley in Berlin, noted that Chatto was still in his anarchist period and used to supply him with anarchist literature to read. Also, according to Smedley, Chatto would often visit Bergman, and the two would argue and bicker like old friends, actually, which I think suggests a form of close friendship between the two of them. And it was also through Smedley and Chatto's connections that Emma Goldman's essay, The Heroic Women of the Revolution, was published in the Indian paper Welfare out of Calcutta in 1925. So through Chatto and Smedley in particular at the time, there was some connections to anarchist literature being sent to India as well. And they certainly took part in these debates, in these anarchist debates that happened in Berlin at the time. However, as Emma Goldman recalled of Chatto in her memoirs, and I quote here, "He was intellectual and clever, but he impressed me as a somewhat cunning individual. He called himself an anarchist, though it was evident that it was Indian nationalism to which he had devoted himself entirely." And Rudolf Rocker, similar in his memoirs, concurred with Goldman and characterized Chatto as a nationalist. And indeed, by the mid-1920s, Chatto moved away from anarchism and joined the ranks of the communists, and he became especially close friends with the German communist Willy Munzenberg. And the two of them soon set up the Comintern-backed League Against Imperialism in late 1926, with its first formal meeting held in Brussels in February 1927, which brought in people like Nehru as well, and other prominent people from across the colonial world. So by then, Chatto had moved away from anarchism really and turned more and more towards communism. But by contrast, Acharya drew closer to the anarchists in Berlin and across the world in his efforts to introduce anarchism into India's anti-colonial left-wing struggles. And in August 1925, he wrote to Tom Keel, who was the editor of Freedom in London. Freedom was the oldest anarchist paper, still existing anarchist paper, established by Charlotte Wilson and Peter Kropotkin in London in 1886. So Acharya wrote to Tom Keel, who's the editor of Freedom in London, and asked for copies of Freedom that he could send to India and to friends he knew in Turkey and South Africa as well. And similarly, in October 1925, he wrote to Alexander Berkman, asking also for anarchist literature to be sent to India. And some of the files I've looked at from the Freedom archives show that Tom Keel kept sending Acharya free copies throughout the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, that Acharya then sent on to India, and which sort of suggests that Acharya served as a conduit for anarchist literature to be sent to India. And from early 1926, Acharya also became a regular contributor to other IWMA affiliate papers, such as Der Syndikalist in Germany, and there was a similar paper called Die Syndikalist here in the Netherlands. There was a French paper called Le Voie du Travail, and an American paper called The Road to Freedom. And he often wrote really fierce criticisms of his former collaborator M.N. Roy and other prominent Indian communists such as Shapoorji Saklatwala, basically trying to expose Bolshevism as just another imperialist, statist oppressor of the Indian people, and really dangerous to the struggle for Indian independence. So by then he was writing a lot for well-known anarchist papers across the world. At the same time, he also wrote frequently for the left-leaning Indian paper called The People, which is set up by, I think, Lajpat Rai, and by then edited by Feroz Chand. And Acharya started writing frequently for this paper alongside Chatto and Smedley and Nambiar. And in some ways, the paper seems to have been open to Acharya's views and anarchism more generally, because they also included articles by the Irish anarchist Nanny Florence Dryhurst, and at the request of Acharya, an article by Alexander Berkman entitled An Anarchist on India appeared in the People around that time. So the 1920s, of course, nationalism and various shades of socialism were not the only revolutionary forces at play in India, because Gandhi's non-violence and civil disobedience campaigns were seriously challenging British rule, which then also in turn attracted the attention of sort of anti-militarist anarchists from across the world. Because indeed, a key concern among anarchists and the global radical left after the First World War and the Russian Revolution in particular was the issue of militarism. Most of the anarchist movement had been against the First World War in general, and took an anti-militarist position. And in 1921, at the initiative of the Dutch anarchist Bart de Ligt, the International Anti-Militarist Bureau, the IAMB, was founded as a successor to the Dutch and International Anti-Militarist Union. And a few years later, it was affiliated directly with the IWMA. So the International Anti-Militarist Bureau became affiliated directly with the anarcho-syndicalist IWMA, because there were so many overlaps between the two organizations anyway. That said, in 1926, it was decided at a meeting in Berlin to separate the two organizations and instead form a specific anarchist organization called the International Anti-Militarist Commission, which is, as I said, was a specific anarchist anti-militarist organization. And in the press services, sort of a monthly press service they issued, both the IAMB and the IAK, prominent members such as Bart de Ligt and Albert de Jong and Arthur Müller-Lening, also Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, often concerned themselves with Gandhi's struggles in India. And the IAMB in particular combined anti-militarism with anti-colonialism, to the extent that actually the organization was affiliated with the League Against Imperialism. So going back to Chatto's connections with the League Against Imperialism, suddenly the sort of more anarchist wing, the anarchist wing of the anti-militarism was affiliated with the League Against Imperialism. So at the same time, at the invitation of his friend M.A. Faruqi, who was a Muslim Indian whom Acharya had known since his time in Russia, the two had actually worked together in the Indian Revolutionary Association. At the invitation of Faruqi, Acharya soon joined both the IAMB and the IAK, with Augustin Souchi vouching for Acharya's anarchist credentials to Albert de Jong. And articles from these organizations soon appeared in the Indian paper, The People. So again, so the anarchist anti-militarist movement that took place at the time soon filtered back into India through Acharya's connections to the paper called The People. And working first as a translator for the press service, Acharya also soon became a regular contributor to these papers, often challenging actually the admiration the likes of Bart de Ligt and Albert de Jong had for Gandhi. He felt that Gandhi did not disavow the state as much as he should, although at other times he celebrated Gandhi's efforts and called him an anarchist tactician of the first magnitude. What's more, Acharya was critical of the IAMB's affiliation with the League Against Imperialism because of its ties to the Comintern. Although Acharya was also a member of the League Against Imperialism, so his position was somewhat ambivalent. The secretary and Acharya's friend Arthur Müller-Lening explained to Acharya that this was the first time the IAMB had reached the colonial world, as he said, and they would for now continue working with the League as long as they felt that it was useful, and they didn't submit their own organization, their own work to the Communist International. So the sort of the networks between the Communist International, the League Against Imperialism, the International Anti-Militarist Bureau, the International Anti-Militarist Commission, and the anarchists are quite close at that time. But I think the IAMB and the IAK represented ways for Acharya to bring the question of anti-colonialism into conversation with anti-militarism and anarchism at the time. And I think at the same time, as Arthur Müller-Lening said, these organizations certainly brought anarchists into contact with the colonial world in ways that had previously been impossible. So that takes us to the sort of late 1920s, early 1930s, when the rise of fascism and Nazism in Berlin and Europe more generally really changed the situation for the anarchists and the Indians in Berlin. Chatto had been summoned to Moscow by the Bolsheviks in 1932, basically to answer for his wartime activities and his connections with Germany at the time. He was eventually purged by Stalin in 1937. The anarchists, the anarcho-syndicalist IWMA, was also banned by Hitler in 1933 and moved its headquarters to Madrid. Acharya fled Berlin in 1934, perhaps alerted by the arrest of his friend Nambia in September 1933. And he briefly lived with his wife's relatives in Zurich and spent some time in Paris before he moved back to India in March 1935. So just to wrap up here, throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, I think anarchism and anti-colonialism and anti-militarism were weaved together through the activities of Acharya and Chatto in Berlin. From the German capital, a concerted effort was made to bring anarchism into India's freedom struggle through organizations such as the IWMA, the IAMB, and the IAK, and articles on anarchism made their way into the Indian paper The People. At the same time, the question of colonialism and anti-colonial struggles in India, not just from a sort of a Eurocentric perspective on Gandhi, became part of anarchist conversations during that period. But despite Acharya's efforts, this did not, I think, translate into a bigger anarchist movement in India at the time. And this is, Sarthak, this is something we talked a bit about in our conversation as well. I'll end here, but I think we could take some questions or comments or anything if you have anything. Does it all work?
Thanks, Ole. So, yeah, we are open for questions now. If people can first raise hand and then ask the questions, and otherwise, like if someone wants to just drop a message, then someone or I will read out the question. So either of the options. So yeah. I'll go first.
Okay.
Yeah. So you were mentioning Indian House in London. You said that Acharya was part of this quite radical Indian nationalist group there, and can you like briefly talk a little bit about experience of Indian House and specifically about Savarkar there? Indian, like that Savarkar figure is now still quite important in India given his ideology of Hindutva, and so what can you like? Even Acharya in later years after independence or transfer of power, whichever whatever one wants to call it, uh, did write articles about Savarkar and so yeah. Can you
Yeah,
talk more about Savarkar and his ideology?
yeah. It's a really interesting question. So like I've sort of gone back to this recently again. Um, so just basically, Acharya arrived at India House. So India House was set up by Shyamji Krishna Varma in, I think, July 1905. Savarkar arrived in, I think, June 1906, and soon became one of the leaders of the India House group, um, and was certainly the most militant and radical. Um, and and obviously he's a controversial figure. There's been efforts to sort of redeem his activities at India House in some ways recently. But even so, the intelligence files that I've seen from then, Savarkar was espousing sort of anti-Muslim sentiments at India House already then. Um, so we have to be careful with the ways in which we think about this figure. Now, at the time Acharya arrived at India House in late 1908, he stayed at India House from late 1908 until around June 1909. And Savarkar was very much the leader of India House at the time. He was writing his sort of revisionist uh, history, what's it called, the Indian War of Independence of 1857. Um, and and I think Acharya, well, he was 21. He was quite young at the time. He completely fell under the spell of Savarkar and VVS Iyer, who was another uh, Tamil revolutionary who was working closely with Savarkar there. Um, and he was full of admiration for their militancy, and was apparently being, they tried to talk him into sacrificing himself or to become a martyr in the struggle for Indian independence already at that time by undertaking assassination. I don't know if this is just speculation or rumors. There's a lot of that going on. But certainly at the time, Acharya was full of admiration for Savarkar. And it seems that even later on, Acharya had a great deal of admiration for Savarkar's bravery at that time. Now, so this is Acharya wrote an article on Savarkar, I think in 1937. So this is almost 30 years later, and he's still full of admiration for his militancy and his devotion to the Indian struggle for independence. And in that article from 1937, he doesn't really say anything about the sort of controversial nature of Savarkar. This does come up in a later essay from 1947 to 48, is something around that time called Savarkar criticism, where he really does sort of write off Savarkar as someone who's lost his mind and is really, pointless to engage with him and his thoughts at the time. So there's a transition, I think, for Acharya much later on in his admiration for Savarkar. I think I've recently read, so another India House figure was a Goan nationalist called Continue, who Acharya stayed with in Lisbon briefly and had met throughout the years. And even Continue in the early 1950s, who was, I mean, he was by then a university lecturer in the US and a respectable sort of non-revolutionary career, had great admiration for Savarkar at the time. And I think we have to think of Acharya in relation to that kind of narrative. But I mean, Acharya completely denounces that kind of Hindu nationalism that comes with Savarkar at the time. Does that answer your question, Sarthak?
Yeah. Yes. So Ameya is asking, uh, beside Savarkar, did he ever also engage with the larger question of Hindu nationalism, Acharya?
I mean, he was wary of Hindu nationalism, really, and it's hard to say what he thought about it at the time, sort of in the earlier period, because we don't really have any writings from his hand at the time. That said, so I recently found a letter from 1911. He was in Munich in Germany and had just moved to Istanbul to sort of collaborate with the Young Turks, as they were called, in the Committee for Union and Progress, which was sort of an anti-British organization as well, that was sort of centered around an idea of pan-Islamism. And Acharya was incredibly wary of that kind of pan-Islamism and that kind of sort of, congregating around such ideas. So he was critical of pan-Islamism in the same ways he was critical of sort of pan-Hinduism, or subsuming sort of various Indian religions under just Hinduism. And then quite early on, when we have more of his writings, sort of anarchist writings in the 1920s, he completely dismantles these notions of nationalism, even as they serve to sort of bring people together against or unite people against an outside enemy. He's quite well aware of the dangers of doing that. So from later on, when we start having writings from Acharya from the 1920s onwards, he's very much against sort of Hindu nationalism, and he really dismisses it as worthless. But he is more concerned with communism and Bolshevism, to be fair, and imperialism, British imperialism. But yeah.
Yeah. So we are receiving quite a few questions. I'll read out. Rohan is asking, after returning to India in the 1930s, did Acharya participate in any local anarchist organizing, or did he reserve himself to writing in Bombay for the next few decades? The same
Well,
thing
it's a
we
good
were
question.
talking about.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were talking about. So he returned to Bombay in April 1935, and so now let me start earlier than that. So he fled Berlin in early 1934, at a time when fascism and Nazism was on the rise in Europe. He moved to Zurich with his wife's family and was briefly in Paris. He tried to go to Spain. The Spanish Civil War hadn't started yet, but the things were still going on in Spain, but he was advised against that, and in the end decided to go back to India in 1935. Coming back in April 1935, he didn't really have much of a network. He didn't really know any people, and I think he was struggling early on to connect with the labor organizations, the trade unions, or any other sort of left-wing organizations at the time, and particularly in Bombay. But his friend Ludwala, who he'd met already in Berlin a few years earlier, was there, and he had set up the Indian Institute of Sociology, and Acharya and Ludwala seemed to have formed some sort of friendship, and Acharya's thoughts on anarchism certainly influenced the Indian Institute of Sociology, and we can see that in the publication that came out of that institute, and there's a gradual shift towards certainly more libertarian thinking in that organization. So that's sort of mid 1930s, and then the Second World War cuts Acharya off from sort of the international anarchist environment, and I think from most of his connections. He said later on, just after the Second World War, he said he hadn't worked since 1939. He hadn't done any work. So I think there's a long period where at least I don't know what he did. But after the Second World War in 1945, the Indian Institute of Sociology is revived again, and Acharya seems to become more involved in that organization, and it takes on definitely an anarchist tinge. You know, this much more anarchist writing coming out from that institute, and it changes its name to the Libertarian Socialist Institute, which sort of signals a more libertarian socialist ideology. And they start building a publishing. They set up a publishing wing where they want to reprint classic anarchist texts in India, and Acharya and Ludwala write to various prominent anarchists. That's Rudolf Rocker again, Boris Yelensky, who was a Russian-American anarchist, and various French anarchists to send them literature that they can then reprint through the Libertarian Socialist Institute. So there's certainly that influence, but it seems to peter out again in around 1950. I think there's some disagreement between Ludwala and Acharya, and it seems that Ludwala takes the institute more in the direction of libertarian individualist thinking, rather than sort of libertarian socialist anarchist thinking that Acharya seems to promote. And then in around 1950, there's another attempt to start an anarchist journal in India by someone named D.N. Vanchu. And I don't know much about this figure. I don't really know anything about him. But he's in touch with Acharya, and the two of them also start soliciting articles on anarchism from anarchists in Europe and North America and across the world, really, that they can then include in this new anarchist publication. It was supposed to be called The Crucible. Now, I don't know what happened with that anarchist publication. I don't know if it materialized. I don't know if anyone sent anything, but it seems around 1950 there's an attempt by Acharya and his friend to start another sort of anarchist publication. But as we talked about, Satak, he doesn't engage with trade unions and labor organizations anymore, really. And I think for various reasons, like we talked about, he's been ill for many years. He's been suffering from various chronic lung diseases since the early 1920s. He was already ill when he was in London and Istanbul much earlier on, but he suffered from chronic illness since the early 1920s. His wife dies in 1951. I think that's a huge blow to him. I think the communists have such a strong influence on labor organizations in India that he finds it difficult. With Gandhi's sort of non-violence movement, I think that supersedes Acharya's sort of pacifist, anarchist pacifist ideas in some ways. So I think in many ways his anarchist ideas drown out a bit amidst all of this, all of these other political ideologies that are going on at the time. But that's speculation on my part. I actually don't know. Does that answer your question?
There are a few questions about Acharya's views on caste and Brahmanism. Can you talk about that? And also ask the second question. Also, it's about can you explain Acharya's pacifism and its relation with Gandhi's, and how and what things were Acharya's pacifism reaction to?
So on the first question about caste, he didn't, as far as I know, he didn't really write that much about the caste issue. It comes up in an essay he wrote in the early 1930s called, for a French publication called, it was called On the Question of Race. And he talks about the ways in which the caste system is basically nonsense. It's based on a fallacy. It's based on ideas of sort of purity of religion, that you can have a pure ethnicity or pure race, and it's in the context of obviously the rise of Nazism in Europe, and it's in the context of sort of Hitler's genocide and discrimination against Jews that he writes that. And it's actually a fairly influential essay that he writes, because it circulates amongst other prominent anarchists at the time who start to engage with sort of Nazism and fascism and the race question, and they often turn to Acharya's essay as proof of, or to support the arguments. So that's one of the few essays in which he actually talks about the caste system. It is a blind spot, I think, in his political philosophy. There's another essay in which he's criticized for exploiting the Dalits, the lowest caste, and he responds to this person who criticizes him. Well, you're exploiting the workers in India, and while that argument may be true in some ways, it's a very poor defense, I think, for Acharya not to take this more seriously. So I think that is a blind spot in his own writing. He was dirt poor all of his life, and it's not like he was a rich university educated intellectual who was writing this from a very sort of upper class intellectual background. He was struggling himself, but obviously the caste question seems to be a bit of a blind spot in his writings, unfortunately. So the other question was on his pacifism, where that came from. And I think it came from quite personal experiences during the First World War, and maybe during the Russian Revolution as well. But he'd seen, particularly in the First World War, how that was really an imperialist war, where soldiers were workers who were brought in, and the only people who died in that imperialist struggle were the workers. And he turns to pacifism quite clearly after that, but also inspired by, I think, Gandhi's campaign in India. He certainly, the Salt March in 1930 is a great inspiration for Acharya later on. But as I said, he's also quite critical of Gandhi, and I think there's some personal bitterness almost going on, or sort of jealousy almost. He, right up until after Gandhi's assassinated, he says there's an article he wrote, like too much Gandhi, as he said. So he says there's too much focus on Gandhi. Whereas, but I think that has to do with personal issues, mostly. But he did disavow Gandhi for not taking a complete, for not completely denouncing the state, and that seems to have been the major issue for Acharya. I don't think the two of them ever met, and I don't think Gandhi ever responded to anything Acharya wrote, not that I'm aware of, even though they seem to have traveled in sort of the same circles. But yeah, but to go back to where his pacifism came from, I think it came from his own experiences during the First World War, and then probably also the Russian Revolution. Yeah.
There are a few questions from Anuradha. How long can you stay? Like, we can have a few more questions, right?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I'm going slightly hoarse, but I've got some water.
Yeah. So there are a couple from Anuradha, and she's asking, does Acharya talk about questions of dismantling the idea of gender feature in any way? Also, did he have what kind of transition or post-colonial solution, if any, did Acharya think of? I guess, if not of a nation state, and also. Did Acharya think about politics of language? Any thought, opinion on power of vernaculars?
Yeah. So three really interesting questions. So the first question about gender relations, he wrote quite a lot actually about both the position of women in women workers in India, and actually one of his first essays from 1926 was on the condition of, it was published in German, was on the condition of the position of women in working class movements. I haven't delved too much into it because most of the writing that he did on the gender question is in French and German, and I speak German, but my French is just really rusty, so I'll have to go back to that. But one of sort of a related issue he wrote quite a bit about, particularly in a French anarchist paper, and some of the debates that he took part in, was around questions of gender and sexuality, and sort of the role between men and women, and it was quite widely debated in sort of anarchist circles around that time, and going back to even earlier, but particularly in the 1920s and 30s. This issue of sort of gender relations and the hierarchical structure of marriage, for instance, was debated quite often in anarchist circles, and Acharya took part in these debates, particularly in a French anarchist paper called L'Angle dehors, that means the outsider. And he's actually criticized by some Japanese feminist anarchists at the time, and there's some correspondence between Acharya and the French anarchist called Amon, and then Takamura Itsu, who's a Japanese feminist anarchist. But it's an aspect I haven't looked into too much yet because it's in French and because my French is just really poor. So, but I'll definitely get back to that. So what was the other question about?
Aspects of
Post-independent India.
about post-independent.
Language. Yeah. So language. Yeah. Again, he wrote a bit about. I mean, Esperanto was often promoted as a sort of universal, non-hierarchical language, and it comes up every now and then in some of his writing. But again, he wrote an essay on the introduction of Latin in India, of the Latin script in India, and he had a debate with the French anarchist Armand about this as well, and he said it wouldn't make sense that to introduce that kind of script in India simply wouldn't work, and it was a Eurocentric way of looking at language. So it does come up a little bit in his writings. So Acharya is fluent in. He speaks obviously English, and he comes from a Tamil background. He speaks English. He can read French and German and Swedish. So he worked as a translator quite often for a lot of these anarchist papers, and earned a living by doing that. And so language seems to be quite important for him. He knows the power of language and the power of having the ability to translate. So in that respect, language is important for him. And the final question about sort of it's really how he envisioned post-independent India, and I think it doesn't really change. For him, independence doesn't really change much in the ways in which India should be conceived. So he was sort of along the lines of Gandhi, promoting sort of independent village communes, smaller villages, smaller communes, really. And for him, that doesn't seem to have changed much after independence, because independence really just meant changing the oppressor. You still had a very strong state that oppressed whoever the workers, whoever they wanted to oppress. So whether it was a foreign or native or oppressor, that didn't matter to him. So his vision for post-independent India didn't change much. He still sort of promoted smaller independent village communes federated perhaps into big organizations. He'd gone to there was a, I think, still existing commune outside of New Delhi called Dial Bach or something like that. And he'd visited in 1939 and seems to have written something about it. I don't know what. I haven't found those essays, but he said that he wrote something about that that village and seemed to promote that as an ideal way of living. So that was his vision for post-independent India. Again, this is sort of 1947. He contracts tuberculosis in late 1947, and he's quite ill at the time, and maybe he's struggling to write. Maybe he's struggling to. He loses his voice at one point. He can't speak anymore, and so I think he's struggling to sort of articulate his ideas in some ways around that time as well. But yeah, I mean, really interesting questions about gender, around language, which is obviously important, and post-independent India. Yeah. Any more questions?
I guess this can be the final question. So Amaya is
Sure. Yeah.
asking, he gives a great analysis of emergency power that are part of modern constitutions and how military, police, and jails are often used to protect constitutions during times of emergency. This led me to think about the emergency, notified or not, in place today worldwide during the COVID pandemic. Lessons to help us analyze the present circumstances from Acharya, and also, are there particular aspects of his writing that anarchists in South Asia, third world today, should pay heed to?
Well, I mean, so he did write in sort of general anarchist terms about abolishing prisons and borders and states and all of those things that most anarchists engaged in at the time, and I think we can still learn lessons from that. The fairly classic sort of anarchist ways of thinking about abolishing borders and prisons and whatnot, and how prisons really only serve to protect the wealthy capitalists. So what can we take from Acharya's writings today and to particularly in South Asia? It's a question. It's a really important question, and I would like to turn it back to you again. What do you think? But I think in two things that come up for me is obviously the ways in which at the time the international anarchist movement was quite Euro-American, with a lot going on in Latin America as well. But I think Acharya brought the question of India in particular, but also colonialism and anti-colonialism into those debates. And I think it's necessary to hold sort of the anarchist community accountable to taking into consideration questions around colonialism and anti-colonialism, and not just in some sort of abstract way in which anarchism already takes into account dismantling binary hierarchical structures. I think there's a lot to learn from the ways in which Acharya brought the question of India and anti-colonialism into anarchist debates at the time, and vice versa. Really, obviously, bringing the question of anarchism into left-wing struggles today. And I was I think, Sarthak, I sent that to you, that quote from Ruth Kinner's interview, and to think about what role history plays in this, because I think Ruth Kinner talks about the ways in which anarchism is prefigurative and tries to think about the future through the present, and in doing so, it must also be aware of its past. And I think in some ways, having this history of Acharya grounds anarchism in India in some ways, and hopefully elsewhere, but gives it a history, a foundation to work from. So hopefully that can give some sort of a sense of community, a sense of history to start from. Hopefully that's what this can do in some ways. But I'd like to turn that question back to you guys as well. What do you think? I mean, Sarthak, have you been thinking about this as well?
Yeah, but not particularly about how Acharya can influence in today, but yeah, broadly how anarchist past can. And yeah, as we talked about, like as an organizer, and maybe Acharya isn't a figure to be looking at, because he obviously wasn't in a condition to be a great or even any kind of organizer in the first place. But he did what he could, and I think one thing we can learn from his experience is the first is how anarchism is quite flexible, more flexible than other political movements and ideologies, about how questions of gender and language and anti-colonialism like were being raised and debated, and also being played out in streets in anarchist within the anarchist movement. And while at the same time the communist and other left-leaning political organization and people in fact were like even kicking out Acharya for quote unquote anti-communist activities. These were so yeah, having a sense of this flexible uh, history is quite important, and also at the same time realizing that Acharya was just one figure. Unfortunately, India didn't have many figures for many reasons. Like I would have loved to talk about Bhagat Singh and few other topics, but maybe sometime again in some other session, about how uh, realizing that Acharya was a single person and he didn't represent anarchism broadly, or even anarchism in India, but was one important figure in there. And he too had blind spots like caste being one and maybe few others. So, but yeah, as you said, having that sense of history and community, historic community, gives a ground, helps us ground today's movements better, today's struggle better, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I guess this brings us to an end. I would like to thank everyone who joined us and asked these great questions. And once again, thanks to all for giving us time and joining us today. So thanks everyone. Thanks all.
Thank you so much for inviting me.